I never thought I'd be the mother of a thief, but there I was, staring at a receipt that didn't exist, holding a bag of groceries that technically belonged to $1 billion corporation. How do you teach your child about honesty when the world around them feels like one big scam, and when the price of a gallon of milk feels like a down payment on a house? What happened next would test every value I ever taught my daughter, and it all started with a simple, silent beep that never happened. It was a Tuesday, one of those heavy, humid afternoons where everything feels just a little bit harder than it should. My daughter, Maya, had just turned 18. She was at that awkward, beautiful crossroads where she still looked like my little girl, but was legally an adult, trying to navigate a world that seemed increasingly stacked against her generation. We needed supplies for the week. Nothing fancy, just the basics to keep a family of 4 running. And I'd sent her to the local supermarket chain with $50 and a list. I remember watching her pull out of the driveway in her beat-up sedan, feeling that small, familiar pang of pride. She was responsible. She was helpful. She was everything I'd hoped she'd be. But when she came home 20 minutes later, she seemed normal. She hauled the bags into the kitchen, humming a song under her breath, and started putting the items away. Milk in the fridge, bread in the pantry, a bag of apples on the counter. I didn't think anything of it. I thanked her, she kissed my cheek, and she disappeared into her room to finish her homework. It wasn't until 4 days later that the truth came out, and it didn't come out as a confession. It came out as a casual observation while we were cleaning out her car. I saw the bags, crumpled in the back seat, and I asked her where the receipt was. I'm a bit of a stickler for budgeting, and I wanted to see if the price of eggs had climbed again. Maya just looked at me, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. She told me she didn't have one. I asked if she lost it, and she shrugged, saying she didn't think the machine ever gave her one. Then she paused, a look of slow realization washing over her face. She told me she remembered tapping her card, but she was listening to a podcast, and she just grabbed the bags and walked out. She never checked the screen. She never heard the confirmation chime. She just walked away. $50 worth of groceries, tucked under her arm, completely unpaid for. In that moment, the air in the kitchen felt incredibly thin. I looked at my daughter, this girl I had raised to be kind, to be upright, to be better than the world often expects people to be, and I saw that she wasn't even upset. To her, it was a glitch, an accident, a mistake that had already happened 4 days ago and was now ancient history. But to me, it felt like a heavy weight had been dropped right into the center of our home. We live in a country where 2 major supermarket chains hold a complete duopoly. They own the market, they set the prices, and lately, those prices have been skyrocketing. Everyone knows it. It's all over the news. Investigations into price gouging, corporate greed, families struggling to put meat on the table while these CEOs take home record-breaking bonuses. There's a bitterness in the air whenever people talk about these stores. But as I stood there, looking at the apples she'd brought home, apples that were technically stolen, I felt a deep, gnawing conflict. On one hand, $50 is a drop in the ocean to a corporation that makes billions. They wouldn't even notice it was gone. They probably lose 10 times that much to spoilage and actual shoplifting every single hour. But on the other hand, it wasn't about the money. It was about who Maya was becoming. It was about who Maya was becoming. It was about the precedent we were setting. If you accidentally take something and you realize it later, and you do nothing, is that the same as taking it on purpose? I looked at her and I could tell she wanted me to just drop it. She told me, "Mom, it was 4 days ago. If I go back now, they'll think I'm crazy. Or worse, they'll call the police. It was an accident, I swear." Her voice had that slight edge of panic, the kind that comes when a teenager realizes they might be in actual trouble. And I understood her fear. The thought of my daughter being led away in handcuffs over a bag of groceries and a failed card reader made my stomach flip. but the silence between us was growing louder. I started thinking about the way we talk about the system. We talk about it like it's this faceless monster that's okay to poke and prod. But where does that end? Does it end with $50? Does it end with $100? If the cashier gives you too much change, do you keep it because the bank is rich? My mind was racing, trying to find the right answer in a world that felt increasingly gray. I looked at the groceries again. They felt different now. The milk didn't look like milk. It looked like evidence. The bread didn't look like food. It looked like a test I was currently failing as a parent. I spent that entire evening in a state of quiet turmoil. I watched Maya go about her business, watching TV, laughing at things on her phone, completely unaffected. She had already moved on. The theft, if you could even call it that, was a non-event to her. But for me, it was a shadow in the corner of the room. I kept thinking about the cameras in that store. Modern supermarkets have incredibly sophisticated surveillance. They have facial recognition, they have sensors in the self-checkout areas, they have AI that flags suspicious behavior. Had they caught her? Were they just waiting? Or had she truly slipped through the cracks? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the groceries. It was about the moral compass I had spent 18 years trying to calibrate for her. If I let this go, what was I saying to her? Was I saying that it's okay to be dishonest as long as the victim is rich enough? Was I saying that her integrity had a price tag of $50? I felt this incredible pressure to make the right decision, but I didn't even know what that was anymore. I found myself scrolling through local community groups on my phone, seeing post after post of people complaining about the grocery duopoly. People were angry. They felt cheated by these stores every single day. One person wrote about how they'd seen the price of butter double in a month. Another talked about how the self-checkouts were just a way for the stores to save money on labor while making the customers do the work. In that climate, going back to pay felt almost like a betrayal of the common person. It felt like handing over a victory to the bad guys. But then I'd look at Maya, and I'd see her innocent face, and I'd realize that she was the one who would have to live with the person she was becoming. I couldn't decide if I should force her to go back and face the music, or if I should let her make her own choice. If I forced her, would she learn anything? Or would she just resent me? If I let her choose and she chose to stay silent, would I ever be able to look at her the same way? The tension in the house was subtle, but it was there. I was being shorter with her than usual. I was distracted. Finally, at dinner, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I put my fork down and looked her right in the eye. I told her we needed to talk about the store. I told her that I hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. She rolled her eyes, that classic teenage defense mechanism, and said, "Mom, please, it's not a big deal. Nobody cares." But I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She did care. She just didn't want to admit that she was scared of what doing the right thing might actually cost her. The silence at the dinner table was heavy. The kind of quiet that feels like it has a physical weight, pressing down on your chest until it's hard to breathe. Maya wouldn't look at me. She was focused intently on moving a piece of broccoli around her plate, her jaw set in that stubborn way she'd had since she was a toddler. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just fighting with my daughter. I was fighting with the entire world she was growing up in. To her, this wasn't a moral crisis. It was a glitch in a broken system. She looked up finally, her eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and genuine hurt. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling just a little, "they literally have a monopoly. They've been caught raising prices on essentials just because they can. They're being investigated by the government. Why are you acting like I robbed a family-owned corner store?" Her words hit me harder than I expected, because on some level, she was right. We live in a world where the lines between right and wrong feel like they're being blurred by the very institutions that are supposed to uphold them. I thought about the headlines I'd seen just that morning. record profits for the supermarket chains, while families were visiting food banks in record numbers. I thought about the shrinkflation, where the boxes get smaller but the prices stay the same. It felt like we were being robbed every time we walked through those sliding glass doors. But as I looked at Maya, I realized that her justification was the very thing that terrified me. If we decide that it's okay to be dishonest because the other person or the other entity is worse, where do we draw the line? Does it stop at $50? Does it stop at groceries? I told her that it wasn't about the supermarket. I told her it was about her. If you walk away from this, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, you're carrying that around with you. Every time you walk back into that store, you'll be looking over your shoulder. You'll be wondering if they saw you. You'll be a person who hides things. She scoffed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the air. I'm already a person who hides things, Mom. We all are. Do you think everyone is 100% honest all the time? The world doesn't work like that. It was a cynical thing for an 18-year-old to say, and it broke my heart a little to hear it. I wondered when she had become so disillusioned. I wondered if I had done that to her, by complaining about the bills and the cost of living so loudly over the years. I went to bed that night, but sleep was a distant memory. I kept picturing the scene at the self-checkout. I could see Maya, distracted by her music, probably tired after a long day of classes, just going through the motions. The beep that didn't happen. The green light that stayed red. It was such a small thing, a fraction of a second where a decision wasn't even made, but rather a mistake was ignored. And now, 4 days later, that mistake had grown into a monster. I started thinking about the legal ramifications. What if they had her on camera? What if they were building a case? I'd heard stories about these big chains waiting until someone stole a certain dollar amount over multiple visits before they stepped in and called the police, just so they could hit them with a felony charge instead of a misdemeanor. The thought of a private investigator or a loss prevention officer knocking on our door made my heart race. I got up and went into the kitchen, the very place where the stolen food sat in our pantry. I looked at the bag of apples. They looked so ordinary. They didn't look like the catalyst for a family crisis. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the blue light of the refrigerator humming softly. I found myself thinking about my own father. He was a man of absolute, almost terrifying integrity. I remember once, when I was 10, he realized he'd been undercharged for a hammer at the hardware store. It was only $3, but he drove 20 minutes back to the store to pay the difference. At the time, I thought he was being ridiculous. I remember sitting in the car, huffing with boredom, thinking about all the things we could have done with that 20 minutes. But now, decades later, I understood why he did it. He wasn't doing it for the hardware store. He was doing it so he could look at himself in the mirror the next morning. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was even colder. Maya was getting ready for her shift at a local cafe, moving through the house like a ghost. I tried to bring it up again, but she shut me down instantly. I'm not going back, Mom. It's been 4 days. It would be weird. Just let it go. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door. But before she left, she turned back and said something that haunted me for the rest of the day. If it had been a small business, I would have gone back in a heartbeat. But it's them. They've already taken enough from us. She was gone before I could respond. I spent the day in a haze of indecision. I talked to a friend of mine, a woman I've known for years who has always been my voice of reason. I told her the whole story, expecting her to agree with me, to tell me that I had to make Maya go back. But instead, she sighed and looked out the window. Honestly, she said, I don't know if I'd make my kid go back either. Not right now. Things are so tense out there. You send her back to confess, and you might be handing her over to a manager who wants to make an example out of someone. You might be ruining her future over $50 that the store has probably already written off as shrinkage. Is that worth it? That was the fear that was paralyzing me. The risk of the consequences. If I forced her to go back and the store decided to press charges, I would never forgive myself. I would be the one who ruined her record. I would be the one who put a permanent stain on her life, just to satisfy my own sense of moral superiority. But if I didn't make her go back, I was teaching her that honesty is conditional. I was teaching her that your character depends on who you're dealing with. It felt like a trap. No matter what I chose, I was losing. I spent the afternoon researching. I looked up the store's policies on shoplifting. I read horror stories of people being banned for life over minor mistakes at the self-checkout. I read about theft by conversion and the technicalities of intent. The more I read, the more I realized how high the stakes actually were. This wasn't just a lesson anymore. This was a potential legal nightmare. But then I saw something else. A news article about a woman who had done exactly what Maya did, realized it later, and went back to pay. The manager had been so shocked by her honesty that he gave her a gift card and thanked her for being a good neighbor. There were two paths in front of us. One led to a potential disaster, and the other led to a potential moment of grace. But I couldn't know which one we were on until we stepped onto it. I realized that the decision couldn't just be mine. Maya was 18. She was an adult. This was her first real test of adulthood, and I couldn't take the test for her. But as her mother, I had to decide how much I was willing to push. When she got home from work that evening, she looked exhausted. The cafe had been slammed, and she was covered in the smell of roasted coffee beans and old milk. She slumped onto the couch, and for a moment, the tension between us seemed to soften. I sat down next to her, not saying anything at first. I just wanted to be near her. Finally, I spoke. I didn't lecture her. I didn't tell her she was wrong. I just told her how I felt. I told her about my father and the hammer. I told her about the fear I had for her future and the fear I had for her heart. I told her that I didn't want her to live in a world where she felt like she had to be a version of herself she didn't like just to survive. She listened in silence, her eyes fixed on her lap. I could see her processing it, the wall she'd built up slowly starting to crumble. "What if they call the cops, Mom?" she whispered. "What if I go in there and they take me to a back room? I've seen those videos. They treat you like a criminal." I saw the terror in her eyes, and I realized that her bravado from the night before was just a mask. She wasn't cold. She was petrified. She was an 18-year-old kid who had made a mistake and was now realizing that there might not be an easy way out. I reached out and took her hand. It was cold, trembling slightly in mine. We sat there on the sofa for a long time, the only light in the living room coming from the street lamp outside, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. In that moment, the $50 worth of groceries felt like a mountain standing between us and the rest of our lives. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app, the screen's harsh blue light illuminating both our faces. I scrolled back to Tuesday. There was the gas station. There was the coffee she'd bought before class. But there was no entry for the supermarket, just a glaring, empty space where a transaction should have been. It was digital proof of a ghost crime. "They have cameras, Mom," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "I've seen them. They're right above the self-checkout screens. They look right at your face. They probably have my license plate from the parking lot. What if they're just waiting for me to come back so they can trap me?" Her imagination was spiraling, fueled by the true crime documentaries she watched and the horror stories that circulate on social media about loss prevention officers who act like they're in a high-stakes thriller. And the worst part was, I couldn't tell her she was wrong. These stores were notorious for their aggressive security. They were losing millions to theft every year, and they were desperate to claw it back. I started thinking about the duopoly again. The two massive corporations that owned almost every grocery store in the country. They were currently under a massive government investigation for price gouging. They'd been accused of keeping prices artificially high even as inflation started to cool, squeezing every last cent out of families who were already struggling. I felt a surge of anger toward them. Why was I, a hard-working mother, losing sleep over $50 when these companies were arguably stealing from all of us every single day through inflated margins? It felt like I was being asked to be a saint in a world run by sinners. It felt like I was teaching my daughter to be a lamb in a world of wolves. You know, I said, my voice sounding more tired than I felt, a lot of people would say you gotta win. A lot of people would say that the store owes you that $50 after everything they've taken from us over the last 2 years. They'd say, good for you, Maya. Take the win and move on. Maya looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Do you think that? Do you think I should just keep it? I paused. This was the moment. This was the fork in the road. I could give her the easy way out. I could tell her it was fine, that she was just a small player in a big, ugly game, and that her little accident didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But then I thought about the look on her face when she first told me. Not the fear, but the forgetfulness. The fact that she had simply erased it from her mind because it didn't feel real. And that was what scared me the most. If the things we do don't feel real because they happen behind a screen or against a corporation, then our integrity starts to dissolve. It becomes something we only use when it's convenient. I think, I began carefully, that if you don't go back, you're letting that store change who you are. Right now, you're an honest person who made a mistake. But if you keep those groceries and say nothing, you're choosing to be someone who profits from a mistake. And once you start making those choices, it gets easier to make them again. Next time it might be $100, or it might be something that actually hurts a real person. I don't want you to wake up in 5 years and realize you don't know where your lines are anymore. Maya pulled her hand away and stood up, pacing the small space of the living room. But what if they arrest me, Mom? You keep talking about integrity and who I am, but I'm talking about my life. I want to go to university next year. I want to be a teacher. If I have a criminal record for shoplifting, it's over. Everything I've worked for is gone because of a stupid podcast I was listening to while I tapped my card. She was crying now, fat tears rolling down her cheeks. The weight of the situation was finally crashing down on her. The victory of the free groceries had turned into a poison. I stood up and walked over to her, pulling her into a hug. I could feel her heart racing against mine. We'll go together, I said. We'll go tomorrow morning. We'll ask to speak to the manager. We'll explain exactly what happened. We'll show them the bank statement. We'll offer to pay right then and there. If we're proactive, if we come to them before they come to us, it shows intent. It shows it was an accident. And if they call the cops anyway, she sobbed into my shoulder, then I'll be right there with you, I promised, though my own heart was hammering in my chest. We'll tell the truth. That's all we can do. But hiding is worse, Maya. Hiding is how you turn an accident into a crime. We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other. The house felt quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of a storm brewing. I knew I was taking a massive risk. I was betting my daughter's future on the empathy of a retail manager I'd never met. A person who probably spent their entire day dealing with actual thieves, angry customers, and corporate pressure to keep shrinkage low. I was asking Maya to walk into the lion's den because I believed in a moral code that the world seemed to have forgotten. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the conversation in my head. Hello, my daughter was here on Tuesday and realized her payment didn't process. It sounded so weak. It sounded like a lie people tell when they think they're about to get caught. I imagined the manager's face, skeptical, cold, reaching for the phone to call security. I imagined the mall police showing up. I even thought about just going there myself, without her, and trying to pay it quietly. But that wouldn't teach her anything. It would just be me cleaning up her mess, like I had when she was 5 and spilled juice on the carpet. As the sun began to peek through the blinds, casting a gray, uncertain light across the room, I heard Maya stirring in the kitchen. I got up and found her sitting at the table, staring at the bag of apples. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Her eyes were puffy, and she looked small. Smaller than an 18-year-old should look. She looked like my little girl again, the one who used to come to me when she broke a toy, terrified that I'd be mad. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "We are," I said, trying to sound a lot more confident than I felt. "Go get dressed. Wear something nice. Not like you're going to a funeral, but like you're someone who deserves to be listened to." The drive to the supermarket was the longest 10 minutes of my life. Neither of us spoke. The radio was off. Every red light felt like a reprieve, and every green light felt like a push toward a cliff. As we pulled into the massive parking lot, the store's giant logo loomed over us like a watchful eye. The same store we'd visited hundreds of times, the place where we bought birthday cakes and school snacks, now felt like a fortress we had to infiltrate. We parked near the back, away from the main entrance. Maya sat in the passenger seat, her hands gripped tightly in her lap. She was staring at the sliding glass doors, watching people walk in and out with their carts, oblivious to the drama unfolding in our car. "I can't do it, Mom," she whispered. "My legs feel like jelly. I think I'm going to be sick." I looked at her, and for a split second, I almost turned the key and drove away. I almost said, "You're right, let's just go home and forget this ever happened." The mother in me wanted to protect her, to shield her from even the possibility of pain. But the parent in me knew that if we turned around now, I'd be losing her in a different way. I'd be teaching her that fear is a valid reason to abandon your values. "Deep breaths," I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "We walk in, we find the service desk, and we ask for the manager. We stay calm, we tell the truth. That's the plan. Ready?" She didn't look ready. She looked like she was about to face a firing squad. But she nodded, a tiny, jerky movement of her head. She opened the car door and the humid morning air rushed in. We stepped out onto the asphalt, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, shining down on the giant corporate logo that suddenly seemed a lot more intimidating than it ever had before. The walk from the car to the sliding glass doors felt like a mile. Every step Maya took was heavy, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to make herself invisible. I walked beside her, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The automatic doors whooshed open, and that familiar blast of artificially cooled air hit us. A mix of floor wax, rotisserie chicken, and the faint ozone scent of 100 humming refrigerators. Normally, this smell meant a routine chore, a mundane part of life. Today, it felt like the atmosphere of a courtroom. We navigated through the produce section, past the stacks of perfectly misted kale and the pyramids of oranges. I saw Maya glance at the self-checkout area to our right. It was busy. People were scanning, bagging, and tapping their cards in a rhythmic mechanical dance. The same dance she performed 4 days ago. I saw her eyes fixate on one of the machines, her face pale. I knew what she was thinking. That's where it happened. That's the spot where I became a thief. We reached the customer service desk, a high, plastic counter tucked into a corner near the exit. A young girl, probably not much older than Maya, sat behind it, staring blankly at a computer screen. She looked bored, her chin resting in her palm, her name tag lopsided on her blue vest. To her, this was just another Tuesday morning in a long line of Tuesday mornings. She had no idea that for the two people standing in front of her, the world was currently tilting on its axis. I looked at Maya. She was frozen. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of her hoodie, and she was staring at a display of lottery tickets like they held the secrets of the universe. I nudged her gently. This had to come from her. If I did all the talking, the lesson would be lost. She had to own the mistake, or the mistake would always own her. "Hi," Maya whispered. The girl behind the counter didn't even look up. "Excuse me?" Maya tried again, a little louder this time. The girl blinked and looked at us, her expression shifting from boredom to a mild professional curiosity. "Yeah? Can I help you with a return?" Maya swallowed hard. I could see the muscles in her throat working. No, not a return. I need to speak to a manager, please. The girl's eyebrows shot up. Usually, when someone asks for a manager, it's because they're angry. They've been overcharged, or the produce is moldy, or a staff member was rude. She looked at Maya, then at me, trying to gauge our level of Karen-ness. Finding none, she reached for a black telephone on the desk and pressed the button. Hey, Marcus, can you come to the front desk? Yeah, someone needs a manager. No, they don't seem upset. Okay, thanks. She hung up the phone and went back to her computer, leaving us in a heavy, awkward silence. Those 2 minutes of waiting felt like 2 hours. I looked around the store, seeing it through a new lens. Every security dome on the ceiling looked like a giant, unblinking eye. Every staff member walking by felt like a potential witness. I thought about the corporation that owned this place. I thought about the billions of dollars they made and how they were currently being raked over the coals by the national media for their pricing strategies. Standing here, in the heart of their empire, I felt a strange mixture of guilt and defiance. Was I really doing the right thing? Was I being a, quote, good citizen, or just a, quote, good sucker? If I had just stayed home, nothing would have happened. We would have eaten those apples, drank that milk, and eventually, the memory would have faded into the background noise of life. By coming here, I was inviting conflict. I was inviting judgment. I was potentially inviting a police report. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of doubt. Maybe I was being too rigid. Maybe I was sacrificing my daughter's peace of mind on the altar of an outdated moral code. Then I looked at Maya. She was shaking. Not a lot, but enough that I could see the fabric of her hoodie vibrating. She looked terrified, but she was still standing there. She hadn't run back to the car. She was facing it. And in that moment, I realized that the lesson wasn't about the money or the store or the law. It was about the courage to stand in the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. It was about not letting fear dictate your actions. A door behind the counter opened, and a man in a crisp white shirt walked out. He looked tired, that deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes with retail management. He had a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt and a lanyard that said, Marcus, store manager. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a guy who just wanted to get through his shift without any major crises. Hi there, he said, offering a practiced, weary smile. I'm Marcus. How can I help you today? Maya took a half step forward, her voice trembling but clear. My name is Maya, she said. I was here last Tuesday. I did a full shop, about $50 worth. I went through the self-checkout and I thought I paid. I tapped my card, but I was distracted and I didn't wait for the receipt. I just realized a few days ago that the payment never went through. I checked my bank statement and it's not there. She stopped, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. Marcus didn't say anything at first. He just stared at her, his eyes unreadable. The girl at the desk had stopped typing and was now openly eavesdropping, her mouth slightly agape. This wasn't the usual, I want to speak to the manager conversation. You came back? To pay for groceries from 4 days ago? Marcus asked, his voice slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to make sure he heard her correctly. Yes, Maya said, her voice gaining a tiny bit of strength. It was an accident. I didn't mean to take them without paying. I have the list of what I bought, or at least most of it. I want to make it right. Marcus looked from Maya to me, and then back to Maya. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to call security. I saw his eyes flick toward the back office where the monitors were. I held my breath, my hand instinctively reaching for Maya's arm. The air in the store seemed to grow still, the hum of the refrigerators fading into a dull roar in my ears. Do you have any idea how rare this is? Marcus finally said. His voice wasn't angry. It was almost amused, but not in a mocking way, in a stunned way. People walk out of here every single day with stuff they didn't pay for. Most of them do it on purpose. The ones who do it by accident, they usually just think they got lucky and never come back. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Technically, he continued, I should pull the footage. I should verify the items. I should call corporate and file a report for recovered loss. Maya's face went even paler at the word report. She looked at me, her eyes wide with the I told you so that she didn't have to say out loud. My heart sank. Here it was, the disaster I had steered her right into. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend her, to explain that she was a good kid who just made a mistake. But Marcus held up a hand, silencing me. But, he said, I'm not going to do any of that. He looked at Maya, and for the first time, his tired eyes seemed to soften. I've been managing this store for 12 years. I've seen people fight over parking spots, scream at teenagers over a coupon, and try to smuggle entire hams out under their coats. I have never had an 18-year-old walk back in here 4 days later to confess to a $50 mistake. He turned to the girl at the desk. Sarah, open a manual transaction on Register 1. Just put it through as a general grocery sale for $50. Maya's jaw dropped. Wait, you're not mad? You're not calling the police? Marcus let out a short, dry laugh. For someone coming back to pay? No, Maya, I'm not calling the police. Honestly, you've just made my entire week. It's nice to know there are still people out there who care about being decent, even when nobody's watching. When Sarah handed it to her, Maya took it like it was a holy relic. She stared at it for a long time, her eyes welling up with tears. The weight that had been sitting on our house for the last 4 days didn't just lift, it evaporated. Thank you, Maya whispered to Marcus. Thank you so much. Don't thank me, Marcus said, starting to head back toward his office. Thank your mom for bringing you in. And Maya, keep that receipt. It's probably the most expensive $50 you'll ever spend. But I have a feeling it's worth a lot more than that. We walked out of the store into the bright, hot sun, and as soon as we hit the sidewalk, Maya let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She grabbed me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. I thought I was going to jail, Mom, she laughed into my hair. I really thought I was going to jail. I know, I said, blinking back my own tears. I was a little worried too. As we walked back to the car, the world looked different. The giant supermarket logo didn't look quite so intimidating anymore. The duopoly was still there, the prices were still too high, and the system was still broken. But as I looked at my daughter, I knew that she wasn't broken. She had faced the lion, and she had come out stronger. But the story doesn't quite end there, because as we pulled out of the parking lot, Maya's phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from her best friend Chloe, who had been there the day Maya first took the groceries. Chloe had been the one telling her to just keep them, that it was the universe's way of balancing the scales. Maya looked at the message, then looked at me. She's asking if I kept the $50, Maya said. I didn't say anything. I just kept driving, waiting to see what she would do. This was the real test. Not what she did when her mother was watching, but what she said when her peers were. Maya stared at the screen for a long time, her thumb hovering over the glass. I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Chloe was her best friend, the girl she'd grown up with, shared secrets with, and navigated the treacherous waters of high school alongside. Chloe came from a similar background. Hardworking parents, a tight budget, and a healthy skepticism of anyone in a suit. To Chloe, taking $50 from a multi-billion-dollar corporation wasn't just a mistake. It was a righteous act of cosmic redistribution. I kept my eyes on the road, but my ears were tuned into the silence. Finally, I heard the rapid-fire tapping of Maya's thumbs. I told her I paid, Maya said, her voice small but firm. I told her we went back this morning and I cleared it up. A second later, the phone buzzed again. Then again. And again. Maya sighed, leaning her head back against the headrest. She thinks I'm an idiot. She's saying, "Why would you do that? They don't even care about you. You're literally poorer now for no reason." I felt a surge of protectiveness, but I held it back. "And what do you think?" I asked. Maya looked out the window at the passing suburban landscape, the rows of identical houses, the strip malls, the constant cycle of consumption that we were all part of. I think Chloe's right about the company. They don't care. They're probably laughing all the way to the bank while they overcharge us for bread. But she's wrong about the reason. I didn't do it for them. I did it because I didn't want to be a person who waits until they're caught to do the right thing. She looked at me then, and the fear I'd seen earlier was gone. In its place was a quiet, newfound maturity. It felt like I was carrying a heavy backpack all week, Mom. And as soon as I got that receipt, it was like someone just took it off. $50 is a lot of money to me. That's 5 hours of work at the cafe. But 5 hours of work is better than a lifetime of feeling like I'm hiding something. We drove the rest of the way in a comfortable silence. When we got home, the kitchen felt different. It didn't feel like a crime scene anymore. I started making lunch, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel that nagging sense of resentment toward the groceries. I sliced one of those stolen apples, and as I handed a piece to Maya, I realized how close we had come to a very different ending. If I hadn't pushed her, if I had let her make her own decision without guidance, she probably would have followed Chloe's lead. She would have stayed silent, and she would have learned that integrity is a flexible thing, something you use when it's easy and discard when it's hard. I thought about all the adults I knew who lived their lives that way. People who cheated on their taxes because everyone does it, or who lied to their bosses because the company is rich anyway. It starts small. It starts with a $50 bag of groceries. But as the afternoon wore on, the real world started to seep back in. I was scrolling through the news on my laptop while Maya did her homework, and I saw a story about the very supermarket chain we had just visited. They were being sued for millions for wage theft. Apparently, they hadn't been paying their warehouse workers correctly for years. The irony was almost too much to handle. Here I was, teaching my daughter to be meticulously honest with a company that was systematically robbing its own employees. I felt that familiar flash of anger. The world felt so incredibly lopsided. We hold the little people to the highest moral standards, demanding they be perfect even when they're struggling, while the people at the top can lie, cheat, and steal on a massive scale and walk away with a golden parachute. It made me feel like a fool for a moment. Had I just taught my daughter to be a good victim in a rigged game? I looked over at Maya. She was focused on her textbooks, a half-eaten apple on the desk beside her. She looked peaceful. That was the difference. The CEOs of those companies might have millions, but I doubted they ever felt the kind of pure, uncomplicated relief that Maya had felt when she walked out of that store with her receipt. Integrity isn't a gift you give to others. It's a gift you give to yourself. It's the ability to sleep at night without a knot in your stomach. That evening, the phone rang. It was my sister, Sarah. I told her the whole story, from the moment I found the missing receipt to the encounter with Marcus. Sarah has always been the more pragmatic one in the family. She listened, then let out a long whistle. "You're lucky, sis," she said. "You're really, really lucky. I know a guy who works in loss prevention for a different chain. He told me that if someone comes back to pay, they're instructed to take the payment but still log the incident as a voluntary disclosure in their database. It stays there. If she ever does it again, even by accident, they'll treat it like a repeat offense. You basically just walked her into a trap." My blood ran cold. "They didn't say anything about a database," I whispered. "Marcus was nice. He seemed genuine." "Maybe he was," Sarah said. "But Marcus doesn't own the store. He just works there. The corporate policy is written by lawyers who don't care about lessons or character building. They care about liability. I'm just saying, be careful. Next time, maybe just send an anonymous money order in the mail." I hung up the phone, my mind spinning. The fear came rushing back, 10 times stronger than before. Had I put Maya on a list? Had I tried to be a good parent only to end up being a naive one? I started second-guessing every word Marcus had said. Was his tired smile actually a mask? Was he being nice just to get her to admit to the date and time so they could find the footage more easily? I didn't tell Maya what Sarah had said. I couldn't. I didn't want to ruin the peace she'd finally found. But I spent the night back in that familiar state of hypervigilance. I found myself looking out the window whenever a car slowed down in front of our house. I imagined the letter from the corporate legal department arriving in the mail, demanding civil recovery fees, a common tactic where stores demand hundreds of dollars in damages from shoplifters, even if the goods were returned or paid for. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. Every time Maya came home from school or work, I scanned her face for any sign of trouble. I waited for her to tell me that she'd been pulled aside by a security guard, or that she'd received a weird email. But nothing happened. Life went on. The sun rose and set. The milk she'd stolen was finished, and the carton was recycled. Then, on Friday, something unexpected happened. Maya came home from her shift at the cafe, and she looked different. She wasn't just relieved, she was glowing. She dropped her bag and sat down at the kitchen table. "You won't believe who came into the cafe today," she said. My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "Marcus, the manager from the store. He was in line with his daughter. She must be about 8 or 9. Maya smiled, a real, wide smile. He recognized me. I was terrified at first. I thought he was going to say something about the incident in front of everyone. But he didn't. He just waited until it was his turn to order, and then he leaned over the counter and said, "Hey Maya, I told my daughter about what you did the other day, about coming back." And then he looked at his little girl and said, "This is the girl I told you about, the one who did the right thing." Maya's voice cracked a little as she told me. He told her that honesty is a superpower, and then he left a $10 tip on a $5 coffee. I felt the tension leave my body in one giant, shuddering breath. Marcus wasn't a corporate drone. He wasn't a shark waiting to pull her into a legal trap. He was a father. He was a human being who was just as tired of the cynicism of the world as I was. He had seen a spark of something good in my daughter, and he had used it to teach his own child a lesson. The relief that flooded through me after Maya's encounter with Marcus was unlike anything I'd felt in years. It was as if a physical weight had been lifted off the entire house. For days, the air in our home had been thick with unspoken tension, a static charge of guilt and fear that made every interaction feel brittle. Now, suddenly, the air was clear. We could breathe again. I watched Maya as she went about her evening, moving with a lightness I hadn't seen since before that fateful Tuesday. She wasn't just the girl who accidentally took groceries anymore. She was the girl who did the right thing. That shift in identity was profound. It wasn't just about what she'd done. It was about who she was deciding to be. But the world outside our front door didn't change just because we'd had a moral victory. The news was still full of reports about the supermarket duopoly. Every evening, the lead story seemed to be another update on the government's investigation into price gouging. Journalists were uncovering internal memos from corporate headquarters, showing how they'd systematically raised prices on essentials, bread, milk, baby formula, far beyond what was necessary to cover their own increased costs. They were profiteering on the backs of families who were already struggling to make ends meet. It was ugly, naked greed, and it was happening on a national scale. One night, while we were watching the news, a segment came on about a single mother who had been caught stealing a pack of diapers from the very same chain Maya had visited. The footage showed her being led away in handcuffs, her face blurred, but her shoulders shaking with sobs. The reporter mentioned that the store had declined to drop the charges, citing their zero-tolerance policy on theft. I looked at Maya, and I could see the color draining from her face. We both knew how easily that could have been her. If she hadn't gone back, if she'd been caught on camera and identified later, would Marcus have been so kind? Or would she have been just another statistic in their zero-tolerance crusade? "It's not fair, is it?" Maya whispered, her eyes fixed on the television. "They can steal millions from people through high prices, but that woman goes to jail for $50 worth of diapers. The scales aren't balanced, Mom." She was right, of course. The scales were wildly, catastrophically out of balance. And that's the hardest part of being a parent in the modern world. Trying to teach your children to play by the rules when it's so obvious that the people who make the rules don't follow them. It makes you feel like you're preparing them for a world that doesn't actually exist. I sat there, trying to find the words to explain the unexplainable. I wanted to tell her that the world is just, but I couldn't lie to her anymore. She was 18. She could see the cracks in the foundation just as clearly as I could. "No, it's not fair," I admitted, turning off the TV. "And it probably won't be fair for a long time. But Maya, you have to decide which side of the scale you want to be on. If the world is full of people who only do the right thing when it's fair, then the world is never going to get better. You didn't pay that $50 for the corporation. You didn't even really do it for Marcus. You did it so that when you see a story like that on the news, you don't have to feel like a hypocrite. You did it so you could keep your own hands clean, even when everyone else's are dirty." A few days later, Chloe came over. She and Maya had been friends since kindergarten, but lately I'd noticed a distance growing between them. It wasn't a fight exactly. It was more like they were starting to speak different languages. Chloe was still stuck in that us versus them mentality, a survival reflex born from growing up in a world that always seemed to be taking something away. She couldn't understand why Maya would give back $50 to a giant that already had everything. They were up in Maya's room, and I could hear their voices drifting down the hallway. They weren't whispering. "I'm just saying, Maya, you're acting like you're better than everyone else," Chloe said, her voice sharp with a mix of defensiveness and hurt. "My dad just got laid off. My mom is working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. If I found $50 on the ground, I wouldn't go looking for the person who dropped it. I'd buy gas. And if a machine glitches and gives me free food, that's a miracle, not a crime." I held my breath, waiting to see how Maya would respond. Part of me wanted to run in there and defend her, to explain the nuances of what we'd been through. But I stayed in the kitchen, gripped by the sudden realization that this was the real test. This was the fire that would temper Maya's new resolve. "I don't think I'm better than you, Chloe," Maya said, her voice steady and surprisingly calm. "And I'm not saying you're a bad person. If I were in your shoes, maybe I'd feel differently. But for me, it wasn't a miracle. It felt like a trap. I kept thinking about what would happen if I got caught. I kept thinking about how my life would be over before it even started. And mostly, I realized that I didn't want the grocery store to have that much power over me. If I keep their money, they own a piece of my conscience. I didn't want to give them that." There was a long silence after that. I eventually heard the front door open and close. Chloe had left. Maya came into the kitchen a few minutes later, looking exhausted but at peace. She didn't say anything about the argument. She just sat down at the table and started her homework. But I noticed something tucked into the corner of her laptop screen. The receipt from the supermarket. She'd taped it there, a small faded strip of thermal paper that most people would have thrown in the trash. To her, it was a badge of honor. It was proof that she had faced a moment of weakness and come out the other side. As the weeks turned into months, the grocery store incident faded into the background of our lives, but its effects remained. I noticed a subtle change in the way Maya moved through the world. She was more observant, more intentional. When she worked her shifts at the cafe, she was the one who stayed late to help a coworker. When a customer left their wallet on a table, she was the one who sprinted down the street to return it. It was as if that one act of honesty had opened a door in her heart, allowing her to see herself as someone who had a responsibility to others, regardless of whether they deserved it. I also found myself changing. I stopped complaining so much about the bills in front of her. Not because the bills were any smaller, they weren't, but because I didn't want her to feel the weight of our financial struggle as a justification for dishonesty. I realized that my own cynicism had been a subtle form of permission for her to be cynical too. I started looking for the Marcuses in the world, the people who were trying to do their best in a broken system. They were everywhere once I started looking. The librarian who stayed open 5 minutes late for a kid who needed a book. The mechanic who didn't charge for a 5-minute fix. The world wasn't just a battleground between us and them. It was a web of small, individual choices that either held things together or let them fall apart. But then, just as things were settling into a new normal, we got a letter in the mail. It was a thick, official-looking envelope with the supermarket's corporate logo in the corner. My heart plummeted. I felt that old, cold dread wash over me. Had Sarah been right? Had Marcus's kindness been a ruse? Was this the legal trap we had been warned about? I held the envelope in my shaking hands, my mind already racing through worst-case scenarios. I imagined a court date, a fine, a permanent mark on Maya's record. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated anger at myself for being so naive, for leading my daughter right into the jaws of the beast. Maya walked into the room just as I was about to tear it open. She saw the look on my face, saw the envelope, and froze. The peace we had built over the last few months seemed to shatter in an instant. "Is it from them?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a growl. "Stay back, Maya. Let me handle this." I ripped the envelope open, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper. It wasn't a summons. It wasn't a demand for money. It was a letter from the regional headquarters. My hands were trembling so violently that the paper rattled like dry leaves in the wind. I could feel Maya's gaze boring into the side of my head. Her breath held so tight, I was worried she might faint. My eyes blurred for a second, the black ink swimming on the page as if it were trying to hide its meaning from me. I expected to see words like notice of intent or civil liability or police report. I expected the cold, sterile language of a corporate legal department looking to make an example out of a teenage girl. But as the letters finally snapped into focus, my heart did a strange, fluttering somersault in my chest. "Dear Maya," it began, "our regional office was recently contacted by Marcus, the manager of our local branch, regarding a visit you made to the store last week. Marcus shared the details of your situation, specifically your decision to return and pay for groceries that had been taken accidentally due to a technical error at the self-checkout." I paused, my voice catching in my throat. I looked at Maya, who had moved closer, her hand clutching the edge of the kitchen table so hard her knuckles were white. I kept reading, my voice gaining strength. "In a retail climate where we are facing unprecedented challenges with loss and security, stories like yours are incredibly rare. While the headlines often focus on the friction between large corporations and the communities they serve, we believe that the foundation of any community is built on the integrity of its individuals. Your actions showed a level of character and honesty that deserves more than just a quiet thank you at a service desk." Maya let out a tiny, high-pitched sob, but her eyes were glued to the paper. I turned the page. "As a gesture of our appreciation for your honesty, and in recognition of the values you clearly hold, the Regional Board would like to offer you a one-time Community Leadership Grant of $2,500 toward your upcoming university tuition. We believe that students with your level of integrity are exactly the kind of future leaders our country needs." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, the same refrigerator that still held some of the groceries that had started this entire ordeal. Maya took the letter from my hands, her eyes scanning the lines over and over again, as if she expected the words to disappear or morph back into a legal threat. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood there, the heavy bond paper shaking in her fingers. $2,500? She whispered. Her voice was flat, stunned, completely devoid of the terror that had been there only minutes before. "Mom, that's almost half of my first-year tuition. For $50? Because I paid $50? I sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, my legs finally giving out. I felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, shock, and a profound sense of irony. We had spent weeks agonizing over the system, over the duopoly, over the greed of these massive entities. We had prepared for a fight, for a struggle, for a life-altering punishment. And instead, we were staring at a reward. It felt like the universe had suddenly tilted back onto its proper axis, but in a way that was so unexpected, it left us dizzy. "I don't understand," Maya said, sitting down across from me. "Chloe said they didn't care. Sarah said they'd put me on a list. Everyone told me that being honest with a big company was like screaming into a void. Why would they do this?" I looked at my daughter, and I realized that this was the most important part of the entire journey. Not the money, not the win, but the realization that even within the most giant, faceless corporations, there are people. There are Marcuses. There are regional managers who have kids of their own, who go home at night and worry about the state of the world, and who are just as desperate for a reason to hope as we are. Maybe they did it for PR. Maybe they did it because it was a tax write-off. But maybe, just maybe, they did it because someone in an office somewhere was moved by the sight of an 18-year-old girl choosing to be honest when she didn't have to be. "Sometimes," I said, reaching across the table to cover her hand with mine, "the world surprises you. We talk about the system like it's a machine, Maya, but machines are built by people, and people respond to character. You showed them that you weren't just a customer or a statistic. You showed them you were a person with a soul. And it turns out, someone on the other end had a soul too." Maya looked at the letter again, and then she looked at the receipt she had taped to her laptop. I could see the wheels turning in her head. The cynicism that had been creeping into her heart over the last few years, the feeling that everything was rigged and that honesty was for suckers, seemed to be receding. She wasn't naive. She knew that for every Marcus, there were 100 people who wouldn't have cared. But she also knew that if she hadn't taken that first step into the store, if she hadn't faced her fear and stood in her truth, none of this would have happened. The next few days were a whirlwind. We had to call the regional office to verify the grant, and the woman on the phone was incredibly kind. She told Maya that Marcus had been beaming when he told the story, and that he'd specifically requested that they do something special for her. It turned out that the store had been having a particularly bad month with shoplifting, and Marcus had used Maya's story in a staff meeting to remind his team that not everyone was out to get them. Her one small act had rippled through the entire store, changing the atmosphere for people she didn't even know. But as the excitement settled, I found myself thinking back to that Tuesday afternoon when it all started. I thought about how easy it would have been to just stay silent. I thought about the apples that had caused so much grief. And I realized that the real story wasn't about the $2,500. It wasn't about the duopoly or the government investigations. It was about that moment in the kitchen when Maya had to decide who she was going to be. I think about the people watching this or listening to this, and I wonder what you would have done. In a world where everything feels like it's getting more expensive, where it feels like the big guys are always winning and the little guys are always losing, it's so easy to justify the small wins. It's so easy to say, they owe me this, or they won't miss it. We've all been there. We've all felt that pull to just let it go, to take the free thing and move on. But if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that your integrity isn't about them. It's not about the store or the bank or the government. It's about you. It's about the person you see when you look in the mirror at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep. It's about the peace of mind that comes from knowing that your hands are clean. My daughter walked into that store a scared teenager, convinced that the world was her enemy. She walked out an adult, knowing that she has the power to change the world around her, one small, honest choice at a time. And to me, as a mother, That's worth a lot more than $2,500. I want to hear from you guys. If you were in Maya's shoes, or in mine, what would you have done? Would you have sent her back knowing the risks? Or would you have seen it as a gift from a broken system? There are no easy answers in a world this complicated, but I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story reminded you that there's still good in the world, maybe share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the real, messy, beautiful choices we have to make every day.